So tonight's Audubon Everglades is excited to welcome Greg Braun, Executive Director of the Loxa-Lucie Headwaters Initiative. Clean water and conservation have played a major role in Greg Braun's life ever since he was a young boy growing up in Indiana, swimming and enjoying the clean water of Clear Lake during summer vacations. These youthful experiences propelled him, or at least partially did, to seek a Bachelor of Science degree in oceanography, to later become an ecological biologist and eventually start a firm specializing in avian and coastal biology and habitat restoration on environmental projects in Florida, the Bahamas, the Caribbean, and to work to protect a variety of threatened and endangered animals and plants, including Florida scrub jays, manatees, gopher tortoises, Johnson seagrass, and a variety of beach and dune estuarine species. The executive director of the Guardian of Martin County and the current chair of the Loxa-Lucie Headwaters Initiative, Greg leads a collaboration of three nonprofits: the Guardians of Martin County, the Treasured Lands Foundation, and the Conservation Fund, whose mission is to design and permanently protect a critically important ecological corridor in southern Martin County, northern Palm Beach County, between the St. Lucie and Loxahatchee Rivers. Greg said that project began as a tribute to Matt Reed, the legendary Jupiter native who championed Florida environmentalism and who helped turn the Endangered Species Act into law while he was serving as the U.S. Secretary of the Interior in the 1970s under Richard Nixon. The project's ambitious long-term goal is to purchase a 130-acre parcel that will protect 70,000 acres of low-lying, undeveloped lands east of I-95 from future development and create a green corridor connecting Jonathan Dickinson State Park and the Atlantic Ridge State Parks, protecting plants and wildlife. Greg currently also serves on the steering committee of the Southeast Florida Scrub Ecosystem Working Group and was past president of the Martin County chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society. Greg was awarded the William Hornaday Award for Distinguished Service in Conservation in 2007, and the Distinguished Service Award from the Martin County Conservation Alliance in 2001, and the Florida Gardens Club Earth Stewardship Award in 2024. Please remember to mute your microphones and turn off your video screens to limit distractions. And please place your questions in the chat, which Audubon Everglades Vice President Natasha Warwick will facilitate. Now, please join me in welcoming Greg Braun, presenting on the Loxa-Lucie Headwaters Initiative. Greg, you can now share your screen and begin what should be a very informative presentation for our audience.
Great. Thanks, Scott. And thank you to the board for your interest in the Loxa-Lucie project. The Audubon board has recently endorsed the project, and we certainly support that. We often hear about conservation projects that are in far off locations and deal with unusual or notable threatened or endangered species. But for those of you who participate in our local Christmas bird counts and other field trips in the area, you know we've got a lot of very interesting birds and nature wildlife resources here in our own backyards. So I have put a slideshow together, and for about the next 45 minutes or so, we'll go through that. I'll go through the slides fairly quickly, but in order to be able to leave some time for questions and answers at the end. I'm going to try to share the screen here. And is it coming through? You see it in presentation mode?
Greg, it's perfect.
Okay, great. So indeed, I've got some pictures of a variety of the bird life that we see in our Loxa-Lucie project. But let's talk a little bit about how the project got its name and kind of what's going on with the whole area. Scott, you mentioned that the sort of inspiration behind this project was the passing of Nathaniel Reed back in 2018. And while many of you may know about the Hobe Sound National Wildlife Refuge that has now been named for him, the Reed family has quite a legacy of protecting environmentally valuable lands in the southeastern Martin County area. You may not know that it was the Reed family that ended up donating property to the Nature Conservancy for the Blowing Rocks property, and also the northerlymost 7 miles of Jupiter Island, which are part of the Hobe Sound National Wildlife Refuge, but then also part of St. Lucie Inlet State Park. So when Mr. Reed passed away a few years ago, the local land trust, the Treasured Lands Foundation, came to me in my role of the executive director for the Guardians of Martin County, and they said, how about we try to protect the east-west corridor, the gateway towards Jupiter Island, and do it in the name of Nathaniel Reed. Well, while they had this idea of an east-west corridor, I knew from my long-term work here in the county that there's also the need to connect these two areas of state park lands, the Jonathan Dickinson to the south of Bridge Road and the Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park to the north. And so that's how the project got its name, Loxa, because these headwaters drain south towards the Loxahatchee River. And in the northern part of our project area, they drain towards the north to the South Fork of the St. Lucie River. So Loxa-Lucie. And then the other name, the headwaters, is what's in the picture on your screen right now. You know, we think of the rivers that we go canoeing or kayaking down, but not too many people get to see these actual areas that are headwaters. So this is exactly the sort of habitat that it is. This aerial photo was taken during the wet season, and you can see some of these wetlands are nice and full at this stage. Well, towards the end of the rainy season, there's sheet flow off of these areas, and it goes into those waters that are ultimately paddleable. So headwaters could be pretty much dry during the dry season, but then they fill up as you see here. So if it goes squish under your feet, but you can walk through it rather than paddle through it, it is indeed headwaters type area. So this is a map showing the boundaries for our project, and I've identified the major corridors here. So it's generally east of I-95, west of US 1 in the Hobe Sound area, and south of Cove Road and extending down into Jonathan Dickinson State Park on the south. And I put this map up, and I'm going to highlight my oval up here in the top, August of 2011. Trying to connect these lands is not a new concept at all. Here's the yellow oval is showing the boundary of our project. So back over a decade ago, these properties were identified as properties that should be acquired for one reason or another. And so until we got into this, exactly 0 acres had been purchased between 2011 and the current time. Part of the reason that we're interested in this is there was a project that was sponsored by the Treasured Lands Foundation back a number of years ago to identify the most highly environmentally valuable properties or areas in Martin County. And so you see over on the right here the various parameters that were considered in this. And the product is this heat map, where the areas that are the brightest in color, the oranges and reds and yellows, are those properties that have the highest environmental value. So it's no surprise that Jonathan Dickinson down here with the scrub jays and four-petaled pawpaws and nesting bald eagles and all that is certainly one of those highly environmentally valuable areas. To the north, this is Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park. So from the ecological perspective, this indeed was a project worth pursuing. Some of you may know about the Florida Wildlife Corridor, and while most of the area here in Peninsular, the south part of the peninsula, is west of Lake Okeechobee, there is part of the Florida Wildlife Corridor project that is here in Palm Beach, Martin, and St. Lucie counties, and Okeechobee as well. So our project is within that area. One of the other reasons that we thought this was a valuable project is for those of you who know about the state park system and their unit management plans. Each state park has to go through this process of identifying how they're going to manage their properties. And as part of that, they are to identify those areas outside their park boundaries that they would like to have in order to sort of control their own destiny. So we've heard a lot about the unit management plans after the proposal to put the golf courses in Jonathan Dickinson last year. But I've served on the advisory committee for these two state parks over the last number of years. And so I was aware that the state parks want to own these properties as well. So what you see are the two maps that I have extracted from the unit management plans for the state parks. The one on the left here is the Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park. And you see the blue hatched areas are portions that they currently own. And the red ones, red kind of sideways hatching, diagonal hatching here, are the properties that they would like to own. And then similarly over on the right, this is the optimal boundary map for the Jonathan Dickinson State Park. And you see the orange properties here that are outside the existing park boundary, but that they would like to own as well. So it fits in perfectly because the Guardians don't want to own and manage these properties. We're sort of serving as the conduit in order to get them to, in the future, turn them over to the state. So that takes me to the Florida Forever project. And most of you are aware of Florida's program for buying new parklands and adding to existing park properties. It's called the Florida Forever project. And there has been this Florida Forever project in our area for a number of years. It isn't called the Loxa-Lucie, it's called the Atlantic Ridge Ecosystem. And a lot of that is indeed properties within the Atlantic coastal ridge. We thought about using that as the name for our project, but we really thought the headwaters is a lot more appropriate because a lot of these areas that we're trying to connect are indeed wetlands rather than the sandy ridges. But this is the Florida Forever project map that the Acquisition and Restoration Council up in Tallahassee is considering. So what does it look like on an aerial photo? I've got here a Google Earth image on which I have superimposed the boundaries of the state park, state parks plural, and then the properties that we're trying to acquire. Now, we don't want to acquire every one of them. This property here, old agricultural fields, some of which are citrus groves and row crop areas that have virtually no environmental value presently. But the properties to the east and the west of them, this one that you see as you're driving along I-95 going north, and this one going south along the boundary of Jonathan Dickinson, has a lot of wetlands in it and environmentally valuable areas. So those are the ones that we're trying to acquire. So why do we think it's so important to do this now? Well, this is an aerial view of the Bridge Road corridor looking towards the east from the I-95 area. And you see most of the habitat is pretty much intact still. And you see some wetland areas here right along the road. And in comparison to that, I've got the next exit to the south of the Bridge Road. And this is the Indian Town Road, so the gateway into Jupiter. So, there are some areas of natural habitat, including Jones Creek and Sims Creek here, but for the most part, these are just remnants of the natural habitat that had been here back decades ago. We've still got the opportunity to acquire these properties. If you drive along Bridge Road, you'll see a number of for sale signs. There are willing sellers on these properties, but you also see some of the yellow county signs saying, letting people know that there is a notice for development of one kind or another. These properties are outside the urban services boundary, and so what our project is trying to do is take these off the books for development and acquire them for conservation while they are still available. So here's what it's all about. The properties generally are these low-lying wetlands, some pine flatwoods and open marshes, good habitat for sandhill cranes and bobcats and endangered plants like the Tillandsia air plant up there at the top, wading birds and a variety of wildflowers. We've gone through the process of identifying the various vegetative communities, and so you see them along the right side of the screen. A lot of wet flatwoods and depression marshes and prairies. And while this area is potentially suitable for development, it hasn't been developed into residential communities yet because Martin County has one of the most stringent wetlands protection standards in the state. So not only would a developer need to protect the wetlands themselves, but there's also a buffer around each wetland. So they would have to cluster houses in these much smaller areas of uplands. So it just has not been financially feasible up until recently when the development pressure has increased so much for them to be developed. So one of the reasons for our project is also about water quality. And so you see, I took this picture about 20 years ago of kids doing the Huck Finn kind of thing along the South Fork of the St. Lucie River. Well, back then we could do that, but unfortunately now this is more the common situation. We've got a lot of water quality problems in the South Fork of the St. Lucie. So the relevancy of our project for that is I've got a basin boundary map showing the St. Lucie estuary here, and specifically our project is within this South Fork basin, which at 40,000 acres is the largest of the contributing watersheds going into the South Fork. And unfortunately, the South Fork has chronically the worst water quality in Martin County. Some of you may know about the Florida Oceanographic Society's project for monitoring water quality. They've got a number of volunteer monitoring stations throughout the county, and weekly they put out a map showing what the current conditions are. And now you'll see this one was about a month ago, the week of January 2nd to January the 8th. And granted, there was water being discharged from Lake Okeechobee at this time. So that's part of what is overwhelming the South Fork here. But even when Lake Okeechobee is not discharging, often there is very little flow and bad water quality down here in the area where our project goes into the winding South Fork of the St. Lucie. But most of you are probably a lot more familiar with the Loxahatchee River and Jonathan Dickinson than you are with the South Fork. So I put this map in showing the various drainage basins going into the wild and scenic Loxahatchee River, which you see down here. Here's our project boundary superimposed on it. And so you see we're in two different watersheds for the Loxahatchee. The number one is the Kitching Creek watershed, and number two is the North Fork of the St. Lucie. And so those of you who have been up into Jonathan Dickinson and gone on the either the Manatee Queen or paddled by canoe or kayak, you know that the challenge that we have there is saltwater intrusion. So although I'm a big supporter of mangroves and the habitat that they provide, the picture on the right is really showing in very brief overview the situation that we've had there with the cypress trees, some of which are decades old, having been killed, those freshwater loving species having been killed by the saltwater, and instead it turning into a much more estuarine system. So that's all because the properties have been drained over the years, and so we're getting salt water going further and further upstream in the river. to kind of show why this has happened, I've pulled up a couple of aerial photos. This is one from back in January of 1958. So January, it's dry season, but you can see all of these wetlands throughout the whole system. Again, this is Bridge Road. North is up at the top of the picture, and south down here. Jonathan Dickinson, just towards the south boundary of this photo. So you can see all those wetlands and how they historically had been flowing south towards Kitchen Creek and the Loxahatchee. And even in 1958, you can see how Bridge Road is sort of damming up the water. That water that would often flow down underneath the road here. Here's probably a good example. Is this wetland certainly continued south right through here, but the water has been the whole hydrology has been affected by the road, and so the wetlands here have been degraded as a result of that. Well, let's go on and compare that to the current day. This is a 2024 aerial, and I've tried to crop it to about the same kind of dimensions. And you see that those wetlands are even smaller, or some of them have completely disappeared. And certainly south of Bridge Road, you see a lot of the development that has come in. Again, we're outside the urban services boundary for Martin County. So the limitation on development is 1 unit per 20 acres. So there's just not much of a demand for that. But you see how the hydrology has been adversely affected, which is contributing to that saltwater intrusion, both in the river, but also freshwater wells. And we're not getting that percolation down into the superficial aquifer or to people's individual wells. So let's talk about some of the avian beneficiaries of the project. I've got photos of a variety of the different species here, because there are certainly wetland dependent species like the herons and egrets and wood storks. We do get roseate spoonbills feeding in the wetlands as well. Bald eagles are seen in the area, but we don't know of any nests that are within our project area, although certainly at Jonathan Dickinson there are, and over along the Intracoastal Waterway. Great horned owls, certainly, and hawks. And for those of you who know your birds well, you'll know that this is a snail kite. And while we're outside the normal boundary for snail kites, we have seen them here in the Loxa-Lucie. And so it's in those years when they're looking to establish new territories that some of the birds do come up towards our area. We haven't gotten any of the ones that have been satellite transmitter tagged up in our area, but we certainly do see them. So a couple of the species that we often see along the Bridge Road corridor are wood storks, and here you see a couple of roseate spoonbills and some, I think, some snowy egrets and some white ibis. I'm going to cross my fingers that this video works, but let's just try to play this. Here's an adult wood stork that you see, and then there's some juveniles with their little fuzzy heads out here also foraging in these wetlands. And I'm going to pan back just to show you the proximity of all this to Bridge Road. You know, a road that's very highly used. It is the evacuation corridor in and out of Hobe Sound, and so we get a lot of birds there. And I mentioned wood storks specifically because those of you who know about wood storks know that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has identified the core foraging area in South Florida as being 18.6 miles. So that's the distance that the studies have shown that adult wood storks will leave from their nesting colony to catch the prey to bring back to their nests. So here's an aerial photo of the whole vicinity. I'm going to show the boundaries of our project again, and then the 7-mile range for the closest wood stork nesting colony to the north, that being at Bird Island up in Martin County. And then to the south, about 10 miles down to the wood stork colony west of the Solid Waste Authority's property. So for those birds that are looking for aquatic prey to take back to their young, the wetlands within our project are very definitely within their daily sort of foraging range. So what are we trying to do with all this? Certainly it's to acquire those properties that are actively for sale. You know, this is not an eminent domain kind of thing. We want them to have those for sale signs up on them and to fit these different criteria. We want them to have some good quality or restorable habitat. We want them to be able to add to the restoration of the hydrology and protect the corridor between the state parks. So you see the other criteria here that we're looking for in our phase 1 acquisitions. So when Scott was mentioning this, he talked about our first proposed acquisition, which is up here, the red one at that location. Again, just to give you an orientation, this is Bridge Road, I-95 here to the west, the Hobe Sound community here, the bridge over to Jupiter Island, Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park to the north, and here's Jonathan Dickinson. And this was the first one that we sought donations for, and we were able to acquire that property, and we have moved on from there. The phase 2 acquisition was a 20-acre parcel a little bit further to the west. And then what we're in fundraising for right now is acquisition number 3, a 20-acre parcel down to the south of Bridge Road. And we're particularly interested in this one for 2 reasons. Number one, it's immediately adjacent to Jonathan Dickinson State Park. And number 2, this kind of yellow squiggly line is the historic drainage basin, the eastern flowway into Kitchen Creek. So if we're able to indeed complete the exotic species removal and the hydrologic restoration, the water that is currently draining off will be able to restore the hydrology, keep more water on the property, allow for that groundwater recharge, and also allow that water to percolate down more slowly into Kitchen Creek. Oh, I meant to have a little caveat here for those of you who are squeamish. You don't want to pay a lot of attention to this one, because one of the unfortunate things we have found out through this is once we identified this as a project that we were going to invest some time and effort on, unfortunately, we noticed roadkill of a variety of species. So I have some pictures here, wood storks, roseate spoonbills. We started doing a survey to determine kind of what was going on. And the map that you see down here is unfortunately showing that during our survey period here, we had over 650 animal mortalities within the project corridor here. So we started identifying what the species were. You see them color coded down here. I've got brown ones were the mammals, and the light purple are the reptiles, and we've got amphibians in here and birds as well. And so it's a tough problem because there's no easy solution, and it isn't related solely to the birds. The human fatalities, I've got the red line markers to those as well. And there are probably separate stories for each one of those human fatalities, but indeed it could have been some of those were as a result of animals of one kind or another on the road. And certainly most people aren't going to be intentionally hitting a roseate spoonbill or a wood stork, but included in our compilation of roadkill here, we had wild hogs of over 150 pounds. We had 6-foot-long alligators, a whole variety of things. So we have been working with the county to try to figure out what to do about that. And Martin County has been very forthcoming. They weren't aware that this was a problem. The easiest step is they put in these watch for wildlife signs. We continued our monitoring even after they put up the signs, just to show that it didn't solve the problem. What we're angling for is what you see down here on the bottom right in yellow. That's the corridor, the crossing under Indiantown Road in Jupiter, in the Riverbend Park area. And that one is part of the Florida Trail. It's big enough for people to walk under, and certainly for wildlife to get through. You see, not only does it have the upland area over on the left, but it also has a water area. So the river otters and fish and alligators and all that can move through. And so we have identified some federal grants for wildlife crossings, and Bridge Road is a county-owned road, and so we're hoping to work with them to be able to get grants to make some changes to the road itself. It'll make it more, well, safer both for people and for wildlife. So we want to restore the hydrology. We want to also make a connection for people. You know, there's horseback riding at Jonathan Dickinson. There's horseback riding up at Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park. And we would love to be able to allow people to get from one park to the other on horseback or hiking or whatever it would be. And also to put in observation towers right off of the edge of the road or on these other properties. Property up at the upper right picture here, Martin County a number of years ago did a county stormwater treatment area where they're directing water that goes ultimately into Kitchen Creek into this sort of polishing pond. So they've already started the work, and we're just trying to help them out. So a little bit about the timeline of the project. We started this back in November of 2019, after, again, Nathaniel Reed's passing in 2018. And our timing related to the pandemic could not have been worse. We had sent out a bunch of invitations for kind of the debut, the launching of the whole program, and we had to end up canceling it as the COVID outbreak was occurring. But we've been slowly gaining steam. Instead of big meetings, we've been doing these sort of Zoom meetings, and also making presentations to various governmental bodies and nonprofit organizations. So again, part of the reason for us wanting to get into this is the properties are on that Florida Forever list. They have been for decades. And we went up to Tallahassee and said, what's going on? These properties have been on the ranking list for years and nothing has been acquired. What can we do to kind of help things along? And they said, well, there's two things. Number one, nobody's been up here telling us you want us to acquire this property. We need to see some evidence of local support. So we said, okay, we will try to deal with that. And number two, when you think about the land values here in southeastern Florida in comparison to up in the Panhandle or interior areas of the state, we're at a competitive disadvantage based on the per acre value of our properties. So the fact that we have been able to raise millions of dollars so far in just private donations to acquire these properties that we are then going to be offering to the state, we're hoping we'll try to balance that out, and so that we're not at that competitive financial disadvantage. So you see here, we completed the first acquisition in 21. We finished the second acquisition in 2023. We're working on the fundraising for acquisition number 3 right now. And a big thing that we think is at least partially a catalyst by our project is the Martin County Forever referendum that was passed by Martin County voters in November of last year. Some of you may have heard about that. Some of you may have, those of you who live in Martin County are already paying sales tax for it. It's a 0.5 cent increase in the local sales tax for a period of 10 years. So we're hoping to raise over $183 million for that. And a lot of that will go towards these matching fund initiatives through Florida Forever or other kinds of programs like that. So the Martin County Forever project, and part of the reason we were supporting it is that they identified properties in 4 particular areas: the Indian River Lagoon Blueways. So you see a map here showing where those properties are along either the lagoon frontage or in the watershed adjacent to the Indian River Lagoon or St. Lucie. The second one is those properties within the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan footprint. And so you see the map on the right showing those SERP lands. The third area is indeed our Loxa-Lucie Headwaters project. So you see, you know where those lands are now. And then fourth is the Palmar area. So that's the vast area of wetlands at the Palm Beach, Martin County line. So again, that referendum will only be used to acquire properties in Martin County, but you see there are ones throughout the county, and we're hoping that that will help us acquire some of those properties that are valuable as corridors between the existing publicly owned lands already. So over the last couple of years, as we've been giving these presentations, we've gotten a number of endorsements. You see the governmental entities listed over on the left, a variety of the conservation NGOs. And so thank you, Audubon Everglades, for your endorsement of the project. And then there are a variety of other organizations as well. I see Friends of Jonathan Dickinson up here near the top of this list, and we've got Jim Howe on this Zoom meeting as the president of the Friends of Jonathan Dickinson. And there are a number of other just homeowners associations, historical societies. Here's the golf club, a variety of entities. So we think overall it has been a good community type project. So what you can do to help us out with all this, if you're interested, help us out with some kind of openings to other HOAs and governmental entities. Become involved, and I'm going to again give Jim credit here, because not only has he, in his new role as president of the Friends of Jonathan Dickinson, but he's also taken on compiling the Christmas bird count for Jonathan Dickinson. And so Jim's been out to our acquisition number 3 and is helping us compile bird lists for that property. But it is all a volunteer donation kinds of things. I've got the linkage in here for the Conservation Fund. They're sort of the banker for this project. All donations towards it are certainly tax deductible, and I've got the link here for how to make a donation to the whole initiative. So just in closing here, before we get to some questions and answers, I'll again mention, as Scott did at the beginning, the spearheads behind this is this consortium of the Guardians of Martin County, the local land trust, the Treasured Lands Foundation, and the Conservation Fund. We've got a steering committee that meets generally every 2 weeks, and these are the various folks who are engaged with that. And so we've been working on it, and several people have asked me, well, what's kind of the long-term outlook for this project? When will you know you're done? And I say, if you drive down Bridge Road and there are no more for sale signs, then we will have done everything that we can do. But right now, I mean, if they can connect Georgia to Maine with the Appalachian Trail, how can we not be able to connect these 2 state parks that are only less than 2 miles apart? So with that, I've got the identification for the website that we have for this, and we'll open up to questions. And I see Natasha is there, and hopefully you can relay on questions to me.
All right, this was a fantastic presentation, Greg. Thank you. There are several questions in the chat. Everybody keep putting your questions in, otherwise it'll be a lot of my questions. Okay, so several people, Kathy had asked for a link for where donations can be made. That link was in the presentation. And we also put it in the chat so people have access to it. Ann Wiley would like to know, how far along are you with the funds that you need for the acquisition of the third property?
We are about a third of the way through. We have had a very generous donor make a challenge grant to us that if we can raise, let's see, it's 2 for 1. So if we raise $1 million, he'll put in 500,000. And so we are working towards that, finishing that grant right now. And this is one of the reasons that we were so pleased that the Conservation Fund became engaged with our project. They're a nationwide organization, and this is what they do. And so initially, as they got into the program, we were needing to raise money as we went, and we weren't going to acquire that first property until we had every dollar in hand. Well, the Conservation Fund is now confident enough in our ability to raise funds that they have taken money out of their revolving fund and they have just acquired this property. And so what we're now doing is raising the money in order to pay them back so that we can then move on to our next acquisition. So we're well on the way. There's no minimum donation. People make donations of $20 to us. When it goes back to our negotiations with the Florida Forever people, you know, we tell them about the hundreds of people who are making donations to it. And, you know, they don't have to know that some people have only given $5 or $20, but indeed it goes everywhere from there on up to the several hundreds of thousands.
No, it's such a great cause. So Kevin Baker says, great presentation, and he would love for you to come and present at the Loxahatchee River Environmental Control District. So maybe you guys can get in touch after this presentation.
Sure,
Sabine,
that would be great. Yep, I am on the schedule for the town of Jupiter for their town council next month, but yep, I haven't presented to the Loxahatchee River District. That would be great.
Do you guys have like a social media presence at all that people could share as well?
We do indeed. And I don't have the link up for that, but I think if you go to our Loxa-Lucie Headwaters .org, there should be links in there to that.
Okay. Yeah, Sabina shared the link to donate, as well as the link to the Facebook page. You're on it, Sabina. I like it. Kathy asks, what percentage of donations go to the initiative for acquiring these properties versus like administrative and overhead costs?
Okay, well, that's a good question as well. And we have actually had to set up kind of a separate kind of funding category, because if people want to make donations solely to the land acquisition side of things, they make it to the Conservation Fund. If they want to make it to kind of the development of the public relations materials and those sort of things, those donations can be made to the Treasured Lands Foundation and sent to the address that's on the Loxa-Lucie Headwaters website. So there is a distinction there. And unfortunately, even after we have raised these millions of dollars and we've told the Florida Forever folks about this elevated level of local support, we were disappointed that we didn't jump up higher in rank. We went from number 37 in the state to number 34.
Wow.
That was kind of demoralizing for us.
It's still a move up.
Well, it is. So then we started asking, well, we've done what you said we should do. How can we get up there into the top rung for actual funding? And the response was, who's your lobbyist? People aren't giving to our initiative for us to go out and hire lobbyists. They're giving it to us because they want to buy the land. So we haven't gotten into that hiring a lobbyist yet. We have looked into it, but so far we're not going that direction, but we may need to in the future.
Okay.
Oh, so
Um,
back to the question, was a percentage. I would say 95% of the contributions that have come to us are for the actual acquisitions of the properties.
Okay. Um, so you mentioned the Martin County referendum vote for the land, Martin County Forever, I believe. Are you guys working closely? I think Martin County now has like a whole group or whatever that's working on land acquisitions. Are you working with them on this initiative?
We are, yeah, very definitely. From two different perspectives. Number one is that our Loxa-Lucie project is one of those four geographic areas that they're looking to expend those funds. But number two, also through that map that I showed early on with the environmental sensitivity, different categories, that's helping guide acquisitions even outside of our boundary. Now,
Okay.
one of the other projects that the state is working on that we're very interested in is the Rural and Family Lands Program. And while the state legislature has not funded Florida forever to the extent that we wished they would, they have been putting millions of dollars into this Rural and Family Lands Program. And there are 6 different projects in Martin County where the agricultural landowners have applied for those funds for grants. And so that might be another way that some of these properties are preserved.
Okay. Another question from me. So please keep your questions coming in the chat. There is one from Scott, but I'm going to cut him in line. So you guys, you do all the listed species surveys on these lands that are to be acquired, I heard you mention. Have you detected any eastern black rails in any of your surveys? Are you looking for them?
We have not. And I'd say yes and no, because these properties are currently privately owned
Okay.
lands. We're not going onto those properties prospectively, but
Okay.
what we're using is the Florida Natural Areas Inventory database. And, you know, that's not, well, for those of you who don't know, that's a statewide clearinghouse for protected species information, whether it's from Water Management District or DEP or the federal government. The Natural Areas Inventory takes all this information in, and they have this clearinghouse of information, but it is not very specific. Their boundaries are 1 square mile blocks. So we will query their database for the properties that are within our area, but no, we're not actually going on the lands until we own them to be able to do those kind of
Right.
surveys.
That makes sense. No trespassing. And then I just wanted to mention there was a tagged snail kite that was detected off of Bridge Road. I don't know if it was in that area. I think it was 2 years ago. It would be in the snail kite report that came out at the end of that year. Check it out. There was one off of Bridge Road.
Ah, okay. Well, I didn't know that. I sat in on the Audubon Everglades program a couple of years ago that Ken Meyer presented, where he had all of that information about where the tagged snail kites go. And I did follow up with him after that. And at that time, he hadn't had anything within our boundary. But it's sort of like Florida panthers as well. You know, there are tagged, radio transmitter tagged Florida panthers. And most people will say, oh, panthers don't come to Martin County. But we know that they do. I mean, there was one killed on the Beeline Highway a couple of years ago, and DOT has put in a panther crossing under the Beeline. So it's just that the unit effort for radio transmitting panthers, the biggest bang for the buck is if you do it down there in Southwest Florida. And so it's not surprising that the tagged panthers aren't ones that are coming up this far, but we know that they're here.
Right. All right. So Scott it's a 2-part question. The first question is, since most of the property that you are acquiring is from private sellers, have you found that the property owners have been willing?
We definitely have, but they all have their price. And I think it goes down to this is no doubt an oversimplification, but the agricultural property owners, in my opinion, can be kind of grossly separated into two different categories. There are the true agricultural owners who want to do agriculture on their land, and those are the ones that are voluntarily enrolling in the rural and family lands programs and other things like that because they're looking for a way to keep on doing their agriculture. Then there's the other category, which are essentially somebody who puts beehives on his property in order to get an agricultural exemption, and the only thing they're in it for is to make a buck. And those are the folks that, yes, they're willing sellers, but because they're holding out with the hope that the county commission will amend the urban services boundary, they're going to be able to get a lot more money through selling off for development. But that's where our project is in a good position, is by and large, the Martin County Commission is very hesitant to amend that urban services boundary. So as long as we can hold their feet to the fire and not allow increased density of residential development, that keeps the properties within the sort of financial realm that we can handle. We've kind of identified if it's over about $5 to $8 million, we're not going to be able to do it as volunteers. That's where we need to partner with South Florida Water Management District or Florida Forever or some other larger entity than us.
Right. And so you kind of answered the second part of his question is, has Martin County Board of County Commissioners been supportive of this endeavor? And if so, what have they done to support your efforts? So you did kind of answer that.
Indeed, if I went back to that slide, they were one of the first I think they were the first governmental entity that endorsed us. And the Martin County Commission is not unlike the Palm Beach County Commission in one perspective. Very rarely do they all agree on anything, but we were very pleased that the Martin County Commission unanimously endorsed our project. And so we're working with each of, well, with the county administrative staff who have the bigger picture about how the different funds can be allocated. But yes, the commission is supportive of what we're doing.
That's fantastic. One more question from me. So what do you think are the likelihood that we will be able to see a land corridor between Jonathan Dickinson and Atlantic Ridge?
I'd say the outlook is pretty good. Are we going to acquire them all? I would say it's unlikely, because if you remember that aerial photo that I had of the 2024 development, there are a number of properties that have currently been developed in that area. And so it's sort of like a jigsaw puzzle where we're trying to acquire the different ones, and we want them to have these environmental values, and some of them we're not going to be able to acquire. But what we can do is acquire conservation easements on those so that those property owners might allow a pathway or horse trail or something like that. So are we going to acquire them all? I hate to be pessimistic on that. I don't think we will, but we will be able to hopefully acquire the rights for people and water. In fact, that's one of the things that Martin County is trying to do right now, is because they have been unable to come to terms for the sale of a property. What they're currently trying to do in the property adjacent to our acquisition number 3 is purchase a flowage easement. The property owners will continue to own the land, but they will allow the water to flow down from their property into ours and into Jonathan Dickinson and Kitchen Creek.
Nice. So you mentioned some agricultural land, and then I promise I'll stop monopolizing the questions. You mentioned like some of the ag lands out there. So what kind of, do you know the answer to this question? What kind of like remediation efforts or anything are done to make sure there's no harmful like pesticides or herbicides or whatever left over in the soils before they're either converted back to natural areas or to store water?
Yeah, that's a good point. And probably the one property that is the best example of this is one where the Martin County Commission did approve essentially a whole new land use in Martin County called rural lifestyle a couple of years ago. And it was a critical part north of Bridge Road in that flowway, in the historic flowway into the South Fork. And they did all the soil testing as part of the development approval that they got, which is to put a high-end golf course on the property. And they've actually taken that northeasterly most section, and that's where they're doing essentially their mitigation by restoring the hydrology to try to get the water to flow through those historic wetlands rather than through the canals that they're currently there. But it is certainly a problem. We know from the Lake Apopka situation from a couple of decades ago, they tried to rehydrate those former agricultural fields, and there was enough legacy pollutants in there that birds were dying because of it. So as we get into the restoration, the hydrologic restoration of our properties, it's certainly going to need to be a consideration. What we're doing right now is we haven't plugged up any ditches or anything like that. Our focus so far has been on treating the invasive species. So trying to get out the melaleuca and Brazilian peppers and earleaf acacia, those sorts of things.
Right, it's a huge effort. It feels like an unwinnable battle with those species.
And I think we underestimated that. The first property that we did, the 138 acre tract, we had the exotic species contractor go in and gave us a proposal for over $400,000 just to deal with the mess of invasives. And so it's a challenge, but we want to get them out of there, and we want to show the folks who have made donations to the program that we're looking at that sort of restoration.
Well, Greg, this was an amazing presentation. Kathy Ambach in the chat says, thank you very much. Sabina, thank you and your organization. Thank you for your organization's dedication. It's inspiring and encouraging. This is a great presentation. And I could talk to you all night about this, but I will stop talking now.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for your attention and your interest.
Greg, thank you so much. It's a great presentation and so informative, and what the work you're doing is so important. I want to thank you for what you're doing. I know that it's been a long labor of love, and what you're doing, I know, is benefiting wildlife, the habitat, and of course all the people who get to appreciate being there. Some of those slides look like I want to get up there and do some hiking in that area, which I haven't done. So I'm really excited. And I think it's great. And we put the information for the donation in the chat. I know some people are very interested in that. So hopefully this is fruitful in that way as well. And hopefully at some point you'll be able to come back and let us know that it's all done. It's an incredible success. The properties have been purchased. The conservation easements have been arranged, and we'll all celebrate.
Great. Thanks again, Scott.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen now, everyone. So it takes a great team to help bring you these virtual presentations. Some of them you can see are on there, both working behind the scenes, creating the slideshow that you watched, putting up with me. Mary mostly has to do that. But we do, hopefully, we aim to please, and hopefully we have done a good job in that way tonight. And we can't wait to see you on March 4th, 2025, when we'll be hosting Richard Joyce presenting on the magical fireflies of Florida. I added magical, it's just fireflies of Florida is in his title. So have a great night. And maybe we'll see you also at Everglades Day or at Natural Areas Festival Day. Be sure to stop by our exhibiting area for some fun activities. Get to meet Autumn Quixote and her wonderful crew of youth conservation crew members. Some of them are part of the Audubon Florida Youth Initiative program of college students who have joined us. Anyway, have a great night. We'll see you next month on March 4th for Richard Joyce on Fireflies of Florida. Good evening, everybody. Bye-bye.